In the quiet pockets of plain country that thread through the southeastern Pennsylvania ridgelines, the western Ohio bottomlands, the rolling Indiana corn belt, and the long Iowa river valleys, the working draft horse was preserved across the middle decades of the 20th century, not as nostalgia or curiosity, but as the daily mechanism by which a settlement turned soil, hauled timber, spread manure, planted oats, and brought in the autumn harvest. The Belgian draft, heavy-muscled, broad-chested, feathered at the fetlock, chestnut or strawberry roan in coat, descended from the working stock of the Brabant region of Belgium and carried into North American plain communities through a thin succession of Pennsylvania importers and breeders, was the most common of these preserved working horses, and by the late 1960s, the Belgian draft remained on 1,000 small plain farmsteads scattered across 8 states. The horse was selected in those settlements not in spite of the surrounding tractor consolidation, but in deliberate continuity with the older method, a method that depended on the on-farm production of hay, oats, and pasture as fuel, and on the on-farm reproduction of working stock as replacement, and on the on-farm transmission of harness language and draft cadence from one generation to the next. Between 1947 and 1970, the American farm tractor consolidation moved with the steady force of an industrial tide across the Lancaster County corridor, the Berks County uplands, and the western Chester County valleys. And during those 23 years, the number of working draft horses in eastern Pennsylvania fell from an estimated 41,000 head in 1947 to an estimated 4,200 head by the spring of 1970, a decline of roughly 90% in less than a single generation. The dealerships of the John Deere Green and the Ford Blue and the Alice Chalmers Orange and the International Harvester Red filled the small county seat towns from Ephrata to Quarryville to Honeybrook, and the parts counters of those dealerships filled with the steady commerce of hydraulic hoses, fuel filters, ignition coils, and diesel injectors. The fuel for that new machinery came almost without exception from a thin pipeline of imported and domestically refined petroleum diesel, and that pipeline, in the autumn of 1973, would break. The Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries oil embargo, announced on the 17th of October, 1973, in response to the Yom Kippur War of the 6th through the 25th of October 1973, would reach the diesel pumps of eastern Pennsylvania within a matter of weeks, and within 4 months the federal mandatory petroleum allocation program would reduce the eastern Pennsylvania agricultural diesel allocation by 41% below the 1972 baseline, and the 4 mechanized farms surrounding a particular 80-acre Amish farmstead 3 miles east of bird-in-hand Lancaster County would discover in the spring planting season of 1974 that the soil of their fields could no longer be turned on the schedule that the soil required. This is the documentary record of the 80-acre farmstead on Cherry Hill Lane that did not break, and of the working team of 4 Belgian draft horses that turned its plow on the customary schedule during the oil shock of 1974. The mechanization of Lancaster County agriculture proceeded across the post-war period in 3 roughly observable phases. The first phase, running from 1947 to 1955, was the broad adoption among the English farms of the corridor of the small-frame general-purpose tractor, principally the Ford 8N, the John Deere Model B, the Farmall H, and the Allis-Chalmers WC, each in the 20 to 30 horsepower range and each capable of replacing a 2-horse team on the moldboard plow. The second phase, running from 1955 to 1962, was the consolidation of the small frame tractor population into the mid-frame row crop machine, principally the Ford 600 series, the John Deere 720 and 730 series, the Allis-Chalmers WD-45, and the International 460, each in the 40 to 50 horsepower range and each capable of replacing a 4-horse team on the moldboard plow and a 3-horse team on the grain drill. The third phase, running from 1962 to 1968, was the introduction of the 70 to 100 horsepower diesel utility tractor, principally the John Deere 402, introduced in August of 1963. At the John Deere dealership network across the Lancaster corridor, the Ford 4000 introduced in 1965, the Allis-Chalmers D 17 Series 4 introduced in 1966, and the John Deere 3020, carried as a smaller companion to the 4020 line. The John Deere 4020 in particular, with its 95 horsepower diesel engine, its synchro range 8-speed transmission, and its 3-point hitch capable of pulling a 5-bottom moldboard plow at 6 miles per hour, became across the Lancaster County corridor between 1963 and 1968 the single most common tractor of the heavy fieldwork, displacing in those 5 years an estimated 11,000 working draft horses across the eastern Pennsylvania corridor alone. The New Holland Machine Company, headquartered at New Holland in northeastern Lancaster County, extended its dealership network across the corridor in parallel with the John Deere distribution, and by 1968, a New Holland baler, a New Holland forage harvester, and a New Holland manure spreader sat behind a John Deere or Ford tractor on a majority of the English farms of the corridor. The District 6 Old Order Amish Fellowship of the Southern Lancaster County corridor, which encompassed the rolling country east of Bird in Hand, the upper reaches of the Pequea Creek watershed, and the Cross Ridge farmsteads of Cherry Hill Lane, Cocalico Road, Snake Hill Lane, and Bushmiller Road, declined the tractor consolidation across all 3 phases, preserving the working horse as the primary draft on roughly 80% of its member farmsteads through 1968. The Wenzel-Alka Implement Company at Ephrata, founded in 1937 by Heinrich Wenzel and Theodore Alka as a small-frame implement dealership and expanded across the post-war period into a full-line John Deere and New Holland dealership, grew between 1956 and 1968 from a single 1956 metal-roofed showroom on East Main Street in Ephrata into a 6-employee operation serving the entire southern Lancaster County corridor, with new and used tractor sales, parts inventory, mechanical service, and field demonstration. By the autumn of 1968, the Wenzel-Alka territory included 143 English farms and the small handful of progressive Amish operations that had begun the cautious adoption of pneumatic-tired implements pulled by stationary belt power. In the autumn of 1968, on an 80-acre rolling hillside 3 miles east of Bird in Hand, Pennsylvania, a 35-year-old Amish thresher named Daniel Stoltzfus and his wife Rebecca Stoltzfus paid $1,200 in cash for 4 working Belgian draft horses, purchased on the morning of the 11th of October, 1968, at the Topton Farmstead of an elderly Berks County Belgian draft breeder named Aaron Schwartzentruber, then 76 years of age, of the Upper Brunner Road 2 miles north of Topton in Berks County, Pennsylvania. The 4 horses were the working surplus from Aaron Schwartzentruber's autumn 1968 herd assessment, drawn from a Belgian draft line that the Schwartzentruber family had preserved continuously in Berks County since the autumn of 1903, when Aaron's father, Christian Schwartzentruber Sr., had received the Foundation Belgian stock at the age of 26 through a Lititz, Pennsylvania importer named Anton Vanderschaff, who had himself imported the Brabant Foundation from a Belgian draft breeder named Joost van Hove of the Brabant region of Belgium in the spring shipment of 1903. The 4 horses purchased on the morning of the 11th of October 1968 were a 4-year-old bay roan mare standing 16.2 hands at the withers named Bess, a 5-year-old chestnut gelding standing 17 hands named Strider, a 6-year-old strawberry roan mare standing 16.3 hands named Greta, and a 4-year-old chestnut gelding standing 16.2 hands named Haka, each carrying the broad chest, the heavy hind quarter muscling, and the feathered fetlock of the Brabant Belgian Foundation. Daniel Stoltzfus and Rebecca Stoltzfus loaded the 4 horses into a borrowed 4-stall horse trailer drawn by a hired English driver and brought the team the 34 miles south from Topton to the 80-acre Cherry Hill Lane farmstead on the afternoon of the 11th of October, 1968. The Cherry Hill Lane farmstead consisted of a 2-story 1887 farmhouse of mortared local limestone, a 1903 timber-framed bank barn with stone foundation, a 1922 frame implement shed, a 1948 milk house, a stone-walled spring house over a year-round cold spring, an orchard of 23 apple and pear trees planted between 1894 and 1931, and 47 acres of tillable bottomland, 26 acres of ridge pasture, and 7 acres of woodlot along the back fence line. Daniel Stoltzfus had operated the farmstead with Rebecca since their marriage in the autumn of 1956, working the soil with a borrowed 2-horse team from his elder brother, Eli Stoltzfus of the Upper Plank Road, until the autumn of 1968, when the decision was reached to purchase a 4-horse Belgian draft team of their own. Rebecca Stoltzfus, born Rebecca Byler, on the 14th of June, 1933, on a Lititz, Pennsylvania farmstead, carried in her direct paternal lineage the Belgian draft tradition, transmitted by her great-grandfather, Joseph Byler, who had received from the same Anton Vanderschaff import operation in the autumn of 1903 the Foundation Belgian colt of the Byler family line, and the purchase of the 4-horse team in October of 1968, returned to the Bela Stoltzfus household the Brabant Belgian working blood that her own great-grandfather had first brought through the Lititz Gate 65 years earlier. Across the winter of 1968 to 1969, between the 11th of October 1968 and the first warm working day of the spring of 1969, Daniel Stoltzfus undertook the systematic preparation of the 4-horse Belgian draft team for the coming season of field work. The training routine consisted of 3 daily sessions: a morning ground-driving session in the 80-foot stone-walled barnyard, an afternoon harness session in the implement shed, and an evening pasture session along the southern ridge fence line. The morning ground-driving session worked the 4 horses in 2 pairs, Bess with Strider at the front and Greta with Haka at the wheel, on a long-line driving rig that taught the horses the verbal commands of the Lancaster Plain working language: G for right, haw for left, easy for the gradual slowing, and the long-drawn whoa for the full stop. The afternoon harness session fit each horse with the heavy black leather working harness ordered from the Lancaster Plain harness maker Levi Glick of the Upper Maple Avenue in Intercourse, Pennsylvania, who had supplied the Stoltzfus household with a 4-harness set of full-collar Belgian draft tack at a cost of $348 paid out across the months of October, November, and December of 1968. The harness consisted, per horse, of a 16-pound full collar of bentwood frame and oak bark tanned leather, a 32-pound back pad and breeching assembly, a pair of heavy traces of 3/4-inch oak tanned leather, a bridle of single-piece blinkered black leather, and a bit of solid German silver. The plow gear consisted of a 4-horse Evener of seasoned hickory, a pair of double trees of seasoned ash, 4 single trees of seasoned ash, and a 12-inch single-bottom John Deere walking plow of 1947 manufacture, purchased used from an elderly Mennonite seller in southern Chester County for $68 in the autumn of 1958 and refitted with a new mold board share at the Bird and Hand blacksmith Jonas Esch in the autumn of 1968. The first autumn plowing of the 4-horse team, conducted on the afternoon of the 2nd of November 1968 on a 6-acre cornstalk field on the southern slope of the Cherry Hill Lane farmstead, ran the mold board at a depth of 7 inches and a forward speed of 2.8 miles per hour, turning 4 1/2 acres in the available daylight. The evening pasture session, conducted across the months of November and December of 1968, walked the 4 horses single file along the southern ridge fence line, with Daniel on foot at the lead and Rebecca on foot at the rear, settling the 4 animals into the long working stride that the coming spring work would require. By the close of December 1968, the 4 horses were carrying full harness for 6 hours of continuous work, responding to the 8 commands of the Lancaster Plain working language, walking the mold board at the customary depth, and standing quietly at the harness rail of the bank barn through the long February nights. The harness room on the south wall of the bank barn was fitted across the same winter, with 4 numbered pegs for the 4 working collars, 4 numbered pegs for the 4 back pad assemblies, and a long oak shelf for the bridles and bits. On the morning of the 21st of February 1969, Daniel Stoltzfus walked the 1/7 of an acre from the kitchen door of the 1887 limestone farmhouse to the back fence line of the woodlot to clear the wind-thrown timber left by the heavy southwesterly storm of the 18th of February 1969. The storm had brought down a black walnut limb of approximately 11 inches in diameter and approximately 27 feet in length from the upper canopy of the largest black walnut in the back fence line, and the limb had lodged in the crotch of the next black walnut 6 feet from the ground. At approximately 8:40 in the morning of the 21st of February 1969, while Daniel Stoltzfus was working a crosscut saw at the lodged end of the limb shifted on its own weight and fell free of the supporting crotch, striking Daniel Stoltzfus across the upper back and the base of the neck and killing him within the minute. Rebecca Stoltzfus, having been delayed in the kitchen by the early breakfast cleanup, walked out to the back fence line at approximately 9:15 to bring Daniel a thermos of coffee and discovered the scene at the second Black Walnut. The funeral of Daniel Stoltzfus, held on the morning of the 24th of February, 1969, at the District 6 Fellowship meeting at the home of Bishop Aaron Lapp on the Upper Cocalico Road, was attended by approximately 400 members of the Southern Lancaster Fellowship and the neighboring Berks County Fellowship. Rebecca Stoltzfus, 36 years of age, was left with the 80-acre farmstead, the 4-horse Belgian draft team, the harness and plow gear, the 1887 limestone farmhouse, the bank barn, and the working obligations of the coming spring planting season. The spring 1969 plowing began on the morning of the 7th of April, 1969, 10 days later than the customary opening of the District 6 plowing window, and proceeded across the 47 tillable acres of the Cherry Hill Lane farmstead at the 4-horse cadence that Daniel Stoltzfus had drilled into the team across the preceding winter. The plow was held at the handles by Rebecca's elder brother, Amos Byler, of the Upper Plank Road on 6 of the plowing days, and by Rebecca herself on the remaining 17 plowing days. The 1969 spring planting was completed on the evening of the 2nd of May, 1969, 9 days later than the customary closing of the District 6 planting window. The 1969 autumn harvest, brought in across the weeks of late September and early October 1969, ran 3 days behind the customary closing of the District 6 corn harvest window. Word of the widow's continued horsework and of her refusal to consider any alternative arrangement reached the Wenzel-Auker Implement Company at Ephrata by the second week of June 1969 through the implement shop conversation of Earl Faust of the Cocalico Road and the Lancaster County Cooperative Extension Service Field Office in downtown Lancaster. By the third week of July 1969 through the routine farmstead census of the extension agent Floyd Bechtold, the Wenzel-Auker Implement Company at Ephrata, Pennsylvania, occupied a 16,000-square-foot 1956 metal-roofed showroom and parts building on the north side of East Main Street, 4 blocks east of the Ephrata Railroad crossing, with a 3-acre paved tractor lot to the east of the main building and a 1-acre used implement lot to the west. The general manager of the dealership in the autumn of 1969 was Russell Wenzel, 62 years of age, the second-generation Wenzel co-owner, who had taken the general manager position from his father, Heinrich Wenzel, in the spring of 1958 upon Heinrich's retirement. Russell Wenzel carried, at the time of the autumn 1969 territory review, 33 years of full-time employment at the Ephrata dealership, a 1929 Lancaster High School diploma, a 1933 Lebanon Valley College Associate Certificate in Agricultural Commerce, and a reputation across the Lancaster corridor as the most aggressive John Deere salesman north of the Maryland line. The sales representative covering southern Lancaster County in the autumn of 1969 was Owen Hartman, 49 years of age, a 1942 graduate of Mannheim Township High School and a 1947 veteran of the United States Army Quartermaster Corps with service in the European theater, who had joined Wenzel-Auker in the spring of 1948 as a parts counterman and had been promoted to Southern Lancaster sales representative in the spring of 1961. Hartman drove a 1967 Ford F-100 pickup of dealership color, carried a leather sales portfolio of John Deere and New Holland literature, and worked the southern Lancaster territory at a customary pace of 3 farmstead visits per working day and roughly 700 farmstead visits per calendar year. The service manager of the dealership in the autumn of 1969 was Carl Stevick, 54 years of age, a 1933 graduate of the Ephrata Vocational High School Mechanical Curriculum and a 1948 graduate of the John Deere Service School at Moline, Illinois, who had joined Wenzel Acker in the spring of 1949 and had taken the service manager position in the autumn of 1962. Stevick operated a 6-bay service shop, supervised 3 full-time mechanics, and carried responsibility for the warranty work, the customer repair scheduling, and the diagnostic work on the southern Lancaster tractor fleet. The parts manager of the dealership in the autumn of 1969 was Marvin Acker, 47 years of age, the third-generation Acker co-owner who had taken the parts manager position from his father Edward Acker in the spring of 1964, upon Edward's retirement. Marvin Acker carried a 1944 Ephrata High School diploma, a 1949 associate certificate from Penn State in agricultural mechanics, and an inventory responsibility for roughly 11,000 parts numbers across the John Deere and New Holland lines. The Pennsylvania State University Cooperative Extension Agricultural Mechanization Specialist assigned to the Lancaster County Field Office in the autumn of 1969 was Floyd Bechtold, 51 years of age, a 1949 graduate of the Pennsylvania State College of Agriculture in the Agricultural Engineering curriculum, who had joined the Cooperative Extension Service in the autumn of 1949 and had been assigned to the Lancaster County Field Office in the autumn of 1956. Bechtold carried, at the time of the autumn 1969 Territory Review, 22 years of full-time extension service and a regional reputation as the principal advocate of plain agricultural mechanization across the Lancaster, Berks, and Chester County corridor. On the morning of the 14th of April 1970, Owen Hartman of the Wenzel Acker Implement Company drove the 8 miles of state route and county road from the Ephrata showroom on East Main Street to the Cherry Hill Lane farmstead 3 miles east of Bird in Hand, arriving at the wooden gate of the Stoltzfus driveway at approximately 9:20 in the morning, carrying a John Deere 4020 sales brochure, a 7-year financing proposal at 6.3% annual interest, a New Holland forage harvester demonstration card, and a leather sales portfolio. Hartman walked the 84 yards of crushed limestone driveway from the wooden gate to the kitchen door of the 1887 limestone farmhouse and presented the sales materials to Rebecca Stoltzfus at the kitchen threshold. The proposal, written on Wenzel Acker letterhead and signed by Russell Wenzel as general manager, offered a 1970 John Deere 4020 tractor with 3-point hitch, hydraulic power steering, and a 5-bottom mold-board plow at a delivered price of $9,440, financed across 84 monthly payments of $147.22 at the rate of 6.3% annual interest, with the first payment due on the 1st of June 1970 and the final payment due on the 1st of May 1977. Rebecca Stoltzfus listened to the Hartman presentation for approximately 11 minutes at the kitchen threshold, accepted the brochure, returned the financing proposal unsigned, and declined the offer. The visit was recorded on the same afternoon in the Wenzel-Alker Southern Lancaster County Sales Contact Log, entry number 1243 of the 1970 sales year, under the territory code SLA-19 and the outcome code D for declined. On the morning of the 9th of May, 1970, Earl Faust, 68 years of age, the eldest of the 4 mechanized neighbor farm operators and the proprietor of the 180-acre Faust farmstead on the Cocalico Road, stood at the Wenzel-Alker parts counter on East Main Street in Ephrata, waiting on a hydraulic hose replacement for his 1968 John Deere 4020. While Marvin Alker pulled the hose from the back inventory, Earl Faust observed to Owen Hartman, who was passing through the parts counter on the way to the sales office, that the widow on Cherry Hill Lane was going to learn the economics of modern agriculture the slow, expensive way, and that the 4-horse team would be sold to a Conestoga horse auction within the next 18 months. The remark was entered into the Wenzel-Alker counter-conversation log of the morning of the 9th of May, 1970 by Marvin Alker as a routine territory note. On the afternoon of the 7th of June, 1971, Floyd Bechtold of the Pennsylvania State University Cooperative Extension Service drove the 12 miles of state route from the Lancaster County Field Office in downtown Lancaster to the Cherry Hill Lane farmstead, arriving at the wooden gate at approximately 2:10 in the afternoon, carrying a Penn State Cooperative Extension brochure titled The Economic Case for Mechanized Plain Agriculture and a hand-drawn cost comparison showing that mechanized plowing of an 80-acre farmstead saved approximately $1,847 per year over horse-drawn plowing. Rebecca Stoltzfus accepted the brochure, returned the cost comparison, and declined the recommendation. The Bechtold visit was recorded in the Lancaster County Cooperative Extension Service Annual Report for the 1971 fiscal year under the line item Non-Compliant Farmstead. The documentary record of the Cherry Hill Lane farmstead between the autumn of 1968 and the winter of 1974 survives in 3 principal sources, each preserved in a different archival repository and each accessible to the careful researcher who is willing to file the appropriate request with the appropriate keeper. The first source is the Stoltzfus Farm Work Ledger, a leather-bound octavo notebook of 240 ruled pages kept by Rebecca Stoltzfus in her own hand from the autumn of 1968 through the spring of 1979, recording daily field work, harness work, horse care, planting dates, harvest yields, and cash receipts. The ledger is preserved in the District 6 Fellowship Archive at the Bishop Aaron Lapp Homestead on the Upper Cocalico Road. The second source is the Wenzel-Alker Implement Company Southern Lancaster County Sales Contact Log, a series of 6 bound volumes covering the years 1968 through 1975, preserved in the Lancaster County Historical Society Archive on President Avenue in Lancaster. The third source is the Pennsylvania State University Cooperative Extension Service Lancaster County Field Office Annual Report File for the fiscal years 1969 through 1975, preserved in the Penn State University Archive at Pattee Library in State College. The 3 sources together permit the reconstruction of the documentary record at the daily and farmstead level. The Stoltzfus farm work ledger records across the four spring planting seasons of 1970, 1971, 1972, and 1973. A steady and disciplined rhythm of horse-drawn field work that returned the Cherry Hill Lane farmstead to the customary District 6 planting and harvest schedule by the spring of 1971 and held that schedule across the three subsequent seasons. The 1970 spring plowing opened on the morning of the 2nd of April 1970 on the 6-acre Southern Slope cornstalk field and closed on the evening of the 23rd of April 1970 on the 11-acre North Bottom oat field, completing the 47 tillable acres in 22 working days at an average daily turn of 2.1 acres. The 1970 spring planting opened on the morning of the 24th of April 1970 on the 8-acre Lower Bottom cornfield and closed on the evening of the 8th of May 1970, 6 days later than the customary closing of the District 6 planting window. The 1970 autumn harvest opened on the morning of the 29th of September 1970 and closed on the evening of the 18th of October 1970, 2 days later than the customary closing of the District 6 corn harvest window. The 1971 spring plowing opened on the morning of the 29th of March 1971, 3 days earlier than the 1970 opening, and closed on the evening of the 17th of April 1971, 6 days earlier than the 1970 closing. The 1971 spring planting opened on the 18th of April 1971 and closed on the 2nd of May 1971 on the customary District 6 closing. The 1971 autumn harvest opened on the 27th of September 1971 and closed on the 14th of October 1971 on the customary District 6 closing. The 1972 spring plowing opened on the 27th of March 1972 and closed on the 15th of April 1972. The 1972 spring planting opened on the 16th of April 1972 and closed on the 30th of April 1972, 2 days earlier than the customary closing. The 1972 autumn harvest opened on the 25th of September 1972 and closed on the 11th of October 1972. The 1973 spring plowing opened on the 26th of March 1973 and closed on the 14th of April 1973. The 1973 spring planting opened on the 15th of April 1973 and closed on the 29th of April 1973. The 1973 autumn harvest opened on the 24th of September 1973 and closed on the 10th of October 1973. Across the 4 working seasons, the ledger records a steady annual harrowing requirement of approximately 96 working hours of 4-horse team labor, an annual planting requirement of approximately 112 working hours, a steady annual oat acreage of 14 acres rotated across the eastern bottomland fields, an annual manure spreading requirement of approximately 78 working hours of 2-horse spreader work across the months of November and March, an annual timber skidding requirement of approximately 60 working hours of 2-horse skid work in the back woodlot across the months of December and January, and an annual winter haul work requirement of approximately 40 working hours of 2-horse wagon work between the bank barn and the District 6 fellowship meeting locations. The ledger records across the same 4 years: the steady purchase of harness leather conditioner, the seasonal replacement of 2 collars and 1 bridle, the annual shoeing of all 4 working horses by the bird-in-hand farrier Jonas Esch at a cost of $48 per horse per year, and the annual purchase of approximately 1,100 bushels of oats from the District 6 Fellowship Grain Pool. By the spring of 1971, the 4-horse Belgian draft team at the Cherry Hill Lane farmstead had produced its first 2 foals. The mare Bess foaled on the night of the 18th of April, 1970, a chestnut filly of foundation Brabant conformation named Birch, sired by the gelding Strider in the breeding cycle of the spring of 1969. The mare Greta foaled on the night of the 22nd of May, 1970, a strawberry roan colt of foundation Brabant conformation named Cloud, sired by the gelding Hauke in the breeding cycle of the spring of 1969. The 2 foals were weaned at the customary 6 months in the autumn of 1970, halter broken across the winter of 1970 to 1971, and entered into ground-driving work in the spring of 1972 at the age of 2 years. By the spring of 1973, the Cherry Hill Lane working herd numbered 6 head, the original 4 working drafts Bess, Strider, Greta, and Hawkeye, plus the 3-year-old mare Birch and the 3-year-old gelding Cloud, both entering full working harness in the spring of 1973 at the customary 3-year-old transition. The harness room on the south wall of the bank barn was expanded in the autumn of 1972 by the District 6 carpenter Eli Glick of the Upper Maple Avenue, who added 6 numbered pegs for the 2 additional working collars, 6 numbered pegs for the 2 additional back pad assemblies, and a second oak shelf for the bridles and bits. The gelding Hauke, who had begun to show the early signs of hock arthritis in the working harness of the autumn of 1972, was retired from active plow work in the spring of 1973 at the age of 9 years, and transitioned to a breeding role in the District 6 Belgian draft stud rotation, standing at the Cherry Hill Lane farmstead through the breeding cycles of the springs of 1973, 1974, 1975, and 1976. The 2 new foals of the 1972 breeding cycle, born to Bess and Greta in the spring of 1973, were named Ash and Hollis, both chestnut colts of foundation Brabant conformation. The 2 new foals of the 1973 breeding cycle, born to the now working mare Birch and the now working mare Greta in the spring of 1974, were named Tabor and Linden, both strawberry roan fillies of foundation Brabant conformation. By the spring of 1974, the Cherry Hill Lane working herd had grown to 10 head, 5 working drafts in active plow work, Bess, Strider, Greta, Birch, and Cloud, 1 breeding stallion in semi-retirement, Hawke, and 4 young stock in various stages of halter breaking and ground driving, Ash, Hollis, Tabor, and Linden. The harness room was expanded a second time in the autumn of 1973 by Eli Glick, who added a 3rd oak shelf and 2 additional working pegs to bring the total harness room capacity to 10 working harness sets. On the 17th of October 1973, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, meeting in emergency session at Kuwait City, announced a complete oil embargo against the United States and 4 other industrialized nations in response to the United States supply of military and diplomatic support to Israel in the Yom Kippur War of the 6th through the 25th of October, 1973. The embargo took effect on the 20th of October, 1973, and reduced the export of OPEC member state crude oil to the United States from an October 1973 baseline of approximately 1.2 million barrels per day to a November 1973 figure of 0 barrels per day. By the second week of November 1973, the first spot diesel and gasoline shortages began to appear at the independent fuel stations of eastern Pennsylvania, with the small volume diesel suppliers at Ephrata, New Holland, Quarryville, and Honeybrook, each reporting allocation reductions of between 15 and 22% below the November 1972 baseline. By the third week of November 1973, the first formal fuel rationing notices appeared at the regional fuel distributor offices, restricting agricultural diesel deliveries to a 120-gallon weekly cap per farmstead. By the second week of December 1973, the United States federal government had implemented Phase 1 of the Emergency Petroleum Allocation Act of 1973, signed into law by President Richard Nixon on the 27th of November, 1973, which set fuel allocation priorities, favoring military, public utility, hospital, and emergency service consumers over agricultural, industrial, and residential consumers. By the second week of January 1974, the federal mandatory petroleum allocation program, implemented by the Federal Energy Office under the directorship of William Simon, had reduced eastern Pennsylvania agricultural diesel allocations by 41% below the 1972 baseline, with the specific Lancaster County agricultural allocation reduced from a 1972 baseline of approximately 1,900,000 gallons to a 1974 allocation of approximately 1,120,000 gallons. By the third week of February 1974, the 4 neighboring tractor-mechanized English farms surrounding the Cherry Hill Lane farmstead had each received written notification from their fuel distributor that the available diesel for the 1974 spring planting season would be capped at 53% of their 1973 consumption. The Fouse Farm on Cocalico Road, served by the Mountville Petroleum Distributor, was capped at 1,420 gallons against a 1973 consumption of 2,680 gallons. The Marburger Farm on Snake Hill Lane, served by the Lidditz Fuel Cooperative, was capped at 1,710 gallons against a 1973 consumption of 3,220 gallons. The Strausser Farm on Buchmiller Road, served by the Quarryville Oil Company, was capped at 1,140 gallons against a 1973 consumption of 2,150 gallons. And the Baylor Farm on the Upper Old Mill Road, served by the New Holland Fuel and Feed Cooperative, was capped at 1,390 gallons against a 1973 consumption of 2,620 gallons. By the first week of March 1974, the Lancaster County agricultural fuel ration coupons issued by the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture under the Federal Allocation Program had become a regulated commodity subject to mandatory documentation and audit. By the first week of April 1974, the spring 1974 planting season had begun in eastern Pennsylvania, with the 4 neighboring mechanized farms operating their tractors at reduced hours and unable to complete the customary field work on schedule. The Cherry Hill Lane 4-horse Belgian draft team, requiring 0 diesel and consuming only the on-farm hay, oats, and pasture, completed the 1974 spring plowing on the customary District 6 schedule, opening on the 25th of March 1974 and closing on the 13th of April 1974. The 4 mechanized neighbor farms each entered the 1974 spring planting season operating their tractors at the reduced hours dictated by the federal mandatory petroleum allocation program, and each discovered, across the weeks of April and early May 1974, that the available diesel allocation was insufficient to complete the customary fieldwork on the customary schedule. The Faust Farm on Cocalico Road, 180 acres of corn, soybean, and oat rotation operated by Earl Faust and his sons Henry Faust and Dwight Faust, opened the 1974 spring plowing on the 3rd of April 1974 and discovered by the 20th of April 1974 that the 1968 John Deere 4020 had consumed approximately 1,040 gallons of the capped 1,420 gallons against the completion of approximately 93 of the 180 acres. Earl Faust made the decision on the morning of the 22nd of April, 1974, to suspend the mechanized plowing of the remaining 87 acres and to seek alternative arrangements for the completion of the spring planting season. The Faust Farm lost 27 acres of corn to delayed planting that fell beyond the agronomic window for the eastern Pennsylvania 1974 growing season. The Marburger Farm on Snake Hill Lane, 220 acres of corn, oat, and pasture rotation operated by Klaus Marburger and his foreman, Walter Riedel, opened the 1974 spring plowing on the 5th of April, 1974, and discovered by the 24th of April of 1974 that the 1966 Ford 4000 had consumed approximately 1,290 gallons of the capped 1,710 gallons against the completion of approximately 120 of the 220 acres. The Marburger Farm lost 19 acres of oats to delayed planting that fell beyond the agronomic window. The Strausser Farm on Buchmiller Road, 140 acres of corn and soybean rotation operated by Otto Strausser and his daughter Magdalena Strausser-Rusch, opened the 1974 spring plowing on the 7th of April 1974, and discovered by the 26th of April 1974 that the 1967 Alice Chalmers D17 had consumed approximately 860 gallons of the capped 1,140 gallons against the completion of approximately 94 of the 140 acres. The Strausser Farm held back 23 acres of soybean planting until the late June window, which produced a reduced yield of 41% of the customary harvest. The Baylor Farm on the Upper Old Mill Road, 160 acres of corn and pasture rotation operated by Herman Baylor and his sons, Albert Baylor and Kurt Baylor, opened the 1974 spring plowing on the 2nd of April, 1974, and operated the 1968 John Deere 3020 at reduced daily hours of approximately 4 working hours per day against the customary 9 working hours per day of the 1973 season, completing the spring plowing on the 17th of May, 1974, against the customary closing of the 23rd of April. The Baylor Farm lost no specific acreage, but operated the entire 1974 season at the reduced hours dictated by the diesel allocation. On the morning of the 18th of April, 1974, Earl Faust drove the 2.3 miles of Cocalico Road and Cherry Hill Lane from the Faust farmstead to the Stoltzfus farmstead in his 1969 Chevrolet C10 pickup, arriving at the wooden gate of the Stoltzfus driveway at approximately 7:40 in the morning, carrying a handwritten proposal on yellow legal pad paper for the contracting of the Cherry Hill 4-horse Belgian draft team for the completion of the spring 1974 plowing of the Faust farmstead. The proposal offered a rate of $42 per acre against the prevailing 1974 mechanized rate of $14 per acre for the 87 acres of the Faust farmstead that remained unplowed as of the morning of the 18th of April, 1974, for a gross contract value of $3,654 to be paid in cash upon completion of the plowing. Rebecca Stoltzfus accepted the proposal at the kitchen threshold at approximately 7:52 in the morning of the 18th of April, 1974, signed the yellow legal pad proposal in her own hand, and committed the 4-horse team and her elder brother, Amish Baylor, as plow operator to the Faust farmstead for the following 12 working days. The team opened the contract plowing of the Faust farmstead on the morning of the 19th of April, 1974, on the upper North Slope cornstalk field, and closed the contract plowing on the evening of the 30th of April, 1974, on the lower South Bottom oat field, completing the 87 contracted acres in 12 working days at an average daily turn of 7.3 acres of contract work, plus the routine maintenance of the Cherry Hill home acres. On the morning of the 23rd of April, 1974, Klaus Marburger of the Snake Hill Lane Marburger farmstead drove to Cherry Hill Lane to contract the 4-horse team for the completion of 100 acres of the Marburger farmstead at the same $42 per acre rate, for a gross contract value of $4,200. On the morning of the 26th of April, 1974, Otto Strausser of the Buckmiller Road Strausser farmstead drove to Cherry Hill Lane to contract the 4-horse team for the completion of 46 acres of the Strausser farmstead at the same $42 per acre rate, for a gross contract value of $1,932. On the morning of the 27th of April, 1974, Herman Baylor of the Upper Old Mill Road Baylor farmstead drove to Cherry Hill Lane to contract the 4-horse team for the completion of 40 acres of the Baylor farmstead at the same $42 per acre rate, for a gross contract value of $1,680. By the end of May 1974, the Cherry Hill 4-horse Belgian draft team had contracted across the 3 additional neighbor farmsteads and several additional smaller farmsteads at the eastern edge of the District 6 corridor, a total of 700 contracted plowing acres at the standard rate of $42 per acre, for a gross plowing contract income of $29,400 across a single 38-day spring contract window. Rebecca Stoltzfus's 1973 farmstead operating income, recorded in the Farm Work Ledger at the close of the 1973 fiscal year, had been $3,860. The gross plowing contract income of $29,400, realized by the Cherry Hill Lane farmstead across the 38-day spring contract window of the 18th of April through the 25th of May, 1974, represented an increase of 761% over the 1973 baseline farmstead operating income of $3,860. The contract income was deposited in cash across 9 separate kitchen table transactions at the Cherry Hill Lane farmhouse, recorded in the farm work ledger under the heading Spring Plowing Contract Income, with the date, the contracting farm, the contracted acreage, the rate per acre, the gross sum, and the signature of the contracting principal. The contract work itself consumed approximately 340 working hours of 4-horse team labor across the 38-day window, with the team rotating between the Cherry Hill home acres, the Faust farmstead, the Marburger farmstead, the Strausser farmstead, the Baylor farmstead, and 7 smaller contract farmsteads in the District 6 corridor. The plow operator on the contract work was alternately Rebecca Stoltzfus, her elder brother Amos Byler, her cousin Jonas Byler of the Upper Plank Road, and 2 District 6 fellowship men hired at the daily rate of $7.50 per working day. On the morning of the 22nd of June, 1974, the National Geographic Society staff photographer Pierce Whitley, 44 years of age, a 1952 graduate of the Rochester Institute of Technology photographic program and a staff photographer at the National Geographic Society since the autumn of 1962, drove the 138 miles of interstate and state route from his Washington, D.C. office at 17th and M Streets Northwest to the Cherry Hill Lane farmstead, arriving at the wooden gate at approximately 11:15 in the morning, carrying a 1972 Nikon F2 camera body, a 1968 Hasselblad 500C/M medium format camera body, a tripod, a handheld light meter, and a leather assignment portfolio. Whitley had been assigned by the National Geographic Society Director of Photography to produce a feature on Amish agricultural resilience during the 1973-74 oil embargo, with the Cherry Hill Lane farmstead identified through the southeastern Pennsylvania reporting of the Knight Ridder Regional Newswire and the Lancaster New Era newspaper coverage of the spring contract plowing. Whitley spent 5 working days at the Cherry Hill Lane farmstead from the 22nd through the 26th of June, 1974, photographing the 4-horse team at field work, at harness work in the bank barn, at evening pasture, and at the morning watering trough, producing approximately 400 exposures across the 5-day assignment. The resulting 22-page National Geographic feature titled The Plain Plow, with photographs by Pierce Whitley and text by the National Geographic staff writer Margaret Alwyn, appeared in the January 1975 issue of the National Geographic magazine, opening on page 86 and closing on page 107, with the lead photograph showing the 4-horse team turning the 11-acre North Bottom oat field at the customary spring cadence, and the closing photograph showing Rebecca Stoltzfus at the harness rail of the bank barn at the close of an April working day. On the afternoon of the 4th of June, 1974, Owen Hartman of the Wenzel Alker Implement Company drove the 8 miles from the Ephrata showroom to the Cherry Hill Lane farmstead, arriving at the wooden gate at approximately 3:12 in the afternoon without sales materials and without a leather sales portfolio, and inquired at the kitchen threshold of Rebecca Stoltzfus whether the Stoltzfus farmstead would consider the sale of one of the 4 Belgian draft horses as a personal saddle horse for Hartman's own use. Hartman had been notified by Russell Wenzel on the morning of the 3rd of June, 1974, that his position as Southern Lancaster County sales representative would be eliminated at the close of the 1974 second quarter, the diesel rationing of the spring of 1974 having reduced the Southern Lancaster tractor sales of the Wenzel-Ocker Implement Company to approximately 17% of the 1973 baseline. Rebecca Stoltzfus listened to the Hartman inquiry at the kitchen threshold for approximately 4 minutes, declined the proposed sale, and returned Hartman to the wooden gate. On the morning of the 14th of October, 1974, the Atlantic Monthly columnist Cornelius Yoakum, 51 years of age, a Kentucky-born agrarian writer in the Wendell Berry tradition and a regular contributor to the Atlantic Monthly since the autumn of 1966, drove from his Bardstown, Kentucky home the 740 miles of interstate to the Cherry Hill Lane farmstead, arriving at the wooden gate at approximately 1:40 in the afternoon, carrying a leather notebook, a Pelican fountain pen, and an introduction letter from the Atlantic Monthly senior editor Robert Manning. Yoakum spent 2 working days at the Cherry Hill Lane farmstead, interviewing Rebecca Stoltzfus, the District 6 Bishop Aaron Lapp, the elder brother Amos Baylor, and the Cocalico Road contracting principal Earl Faust, and producing across the following 3 weeks a 3,800-word column titled 12 Hooves Against the Cartel that appeared in the November 1974 issue of the Atlantic Monthly. The Atlantic Monthly column was reprinted by the Knight Ridder newspaper chain across the final week of November 1974 and the first week of December 1974, appearing in the Detroit Free Press on the 25th of November 1974, the Miami Herald on the 26th, the Akron Beacon Journal on the 27th, the Charlotte Observer on the 28th, the Philadelphia Inquirer on the 29th, and 12 further Knight Ridder City dailies across the first week of December 1974. The Wenzel-Ocker Implement Company at Ephrata entered formal receivership at the Lancaster County Court of Common Pleas on the 11th of March, 1975, with Russell Wenzel filing the receivership petition under the supervision of the Lancaster firm Hartzell Klein and Associates. Marvin Ocker took employment at the New Holland Feed and Grain Cooperative on the Upper East Main Street in New Holland on the 7th of July, 1975, as the assistant inventory manager at an annual salary of $11,400. On the morning of the 18th of December, 1974, Dr. Spencer Wirtz, 44 years of age, the director of animal husbandry programs at the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, drove the 73 miles of interstate and state route from his office at the 2301 North Cameron Street, Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture building to the Cherry Hill Lane farmstead, arriving at the wooden gate at approximately 10:20 in the morning, carrying a leather folio, a Pennsylvania Heritage Livestock Recognition Program certification packet, and the formal commission of the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture under the surrounding administrative authority of Secretary of Agriculture Kent Shellhammer of the Milton Shapp administration. The Pennsylvania Heritage Livestock Recognition Program had been established by the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture in October of 1974 to recognize and formally register working livestock herds preserved continuously within the Commonwealth across multi-generational lineages of documented historical importance. Dr. Wirtz spent the working day of the 18th of December, 1974, at the Cherry Hill Lane farmstead, conducting the confirmation assessment of each of the 10 head of the Cherry Hill working herd, reviewing the Schwartzentruber lineage documentation back through Christian Schwartzentruber Sr. and Anton Vanderschaff to the Brabant breeder Joost van Hove, reviewing the Baylor lineage documentation back through Joseph Byler and the great-uncle Simon Byler of Quebec to the Brabant horseman Pierre Van Hoot, photographing the 4 working drafts at the harness rail of the bank barn, and entering the formal certification into the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture Heritage Livestock Register at page 14, entry number Lancaster 6, Cherry Hill 1. The certification carried the formal name of the Cherry Hill Lane Belgian Draft Working Herd, the registration date of the 18th of December, 1974. The registered proprietor of Rebecca Stoltzfus, and the foundation lineage of Brabant, Belgium, 1864 to 1903. The Faust Farm on Cocalico Road retained the Cherry Hill 4-horse Belgian draft team for the spring plowing of the 1975, 1976, and 1977 planting seasons at the standard contract rate of $42 per acre, escalated by the prevailing District 6 inflation index. The Marburger Farm on Snake Hill Lane retained the team for the spring plowing of the 1975 and 1976 planting seasons. The Strausser Farm on Buckmiller Road retained the team for the spring plowing of the 1975, 1976, and 1977 planting seasons. The Baylor Farm on the Upper Old Mill Road retained the team for the spring plowing of the 1975, 1976, and 1977 planting seasons. The 4 retention contracts together produced for the Cherry Hill Lane farmstead across the 3 subsequent spring planting seasons of 1975, 1976, and 1977, a cumulative contract plowing income of approximately $71,800 against the cumulative 1972 and 1973 baseline farmstead operating income of approximately $7,400 across the same 3-year span. The Philadelphia Inquirer food and agriculture writer Mariella Castellano filed a regional follow-up feature on the Cherry Hill Lane farmstead in the February 1975 Sunday Agricultural section. In the autumn of 1903, on a mild September afternoon, at the corner of Snavely Mill Road and West Front Street, in the borough of Lititz, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, a 45-year-old old order Amish farmer named Joseph Byler stood at the wooden gate of the Anton Vanderschaff import barn, waiting to receive the first Belgian draft foal of his family line. Joseph Byler wore a full, untrimmed chestnut-brown chest-length beard, streaked with gray, no mustache, a plain white long-sleeve shirt of household woven linen, broad-fall black trousers of heavy wool held by black canvas suspenders, plain black leather work boots of single-piece construction, and a black wide-brimmed felt hat of the District 6 pattern. His wife, Lydia Byler, then 40 years of age, stood beside him in a plain dark blue full-length dress of household woven cotton, a white organdy prayer cap, plain black leather shoes, and a heavy black wool shawl against the autumn afternoon chill, holding in her right hand the woven cotton lead rope of the foal that was about to be transferred. Anton Vanderschaff, the Lititz, Pennsylvania importer, who had received the spring 1903 Brabant shipment from the Belgian draft breeder Joost van Hove of the Brabant region of Belgium, brought from the import barn to the wooden gate a 6-month-old chestnut colt of foundation Brabant conformation, 16.1 hands, projected mature height, broad-chested, feathered at the fetlock, named in the Vanderschaff import book by his weaning name of Anvil. Joseph Byler accepted the cotton lead rope from Anton Vanderschaff at approximately 3:20 in the afternoon of the 17th of September, 1903, paid the agreed sum of $140 in United States gold-backed currency, and led the colt Anvil out of the Vanderschaff import gate onto the Snavely Mill Road for the 11-mile walk south to the Byler farmstead at the Upper Brunnerville Road. Joseph Byler had been taught the working language of Belgian drafts in the summer of 1872, at the age of 14, by his great-uncle Simon Byler, then 47 years of age, on Simon Byler's farmstead at the Upper Saint Joachim Road in the Quebec townships of the eastern cantons. Simon Byler had himself learned the breed in the autumn of 1864 at the age of 39 from a Brabant horseman named Pierre Van Hout, then 51 years of age, who had emigrated from the Brabant region of Belgium to the Quebec townships in the spring of 1864, carrying the working language, the harness fitting, and the draft cadence of the Brabant Belgian breed across the Atlantic crossing of the spring of 1864. The colt Anvil walked the 11 miles from the Vanderschaff gate to the Byler farmstead on the afternoon of the 17th of September, 1903, at the patient 4-mile-per-hour cadence of the Brabant draft, arriving at the Byler stall at approximately 6:40 in the evening, and lived as the foundation working stallion of the Byler family Belgian draft line for the next 23 years, siring 41 foals across the spring breeding cycles of 1907 through 1925, and transmitting through those 41 foals the Brabant Belgian working blood that would, 65 years later, walk through the wooden gate of the Cherry Hill Lane farmstead in the 4 horses purchased by Daniel Stoltzfus and Rebecca Stoltzfus from Aaron Schwartzentruber of Topton on the morning of the 11th of October, 1968. If you have ever raised an animal everybody told you was the wrong one for your county, leave a comment below telling us what it was. And if this story stayed with you, subscribe and ring the bell. There is one of these stories in every county in America. We are working through them one harvest at a time.